Christianity was not the solution, right? You had to go back to pagan values. That's what happened in the Renaissance, was the rebirth of pagan values.
Welcome back. We're dealing with the Dark Ages. Dr. Richard Carrier, you've written on this. You have a book about ancient science. You're a historian. You know a bit about the ancient Greek and Roman world and have actually written on this material. There is just a sweep into the issue. Nil, Gnostic informant, has engaged online, argued with others, Tim O'Neill, you name it. Those who deny using language of Dark Ages, or even might even deny there ever was a Dark Age.
Right, yeah.
There's a growing trend even amongst academics that want to soften the language. And there are many who go, no. Christians literally played a role in devaluing the ancient sciences, the all sorts of stuff, causing us to go down a spiral that led into a Dark Age. So the first question I have, and then take us into Stillman, the opponent. What is the debate? What are they trying to do, and why are they wrong? What are the Dark Ages? And then take us into...
Yeah, so the phrase was originally coined by Petrarch, and his reaction, because he was basically a scholar of literature, and so he was looking at all the ancient literature that was available to him and all the medieval literature that was available to him. And he's writing 14th century, I think, something like that. And he's noticing that the medieval literature is shitty. It's sparser, it's really more primitive, it's not as sophisticated and brilliant as the stuff. So he sees it as a decline in literature, literary quality. He's looking at it aesthetically. It's also the histories are worse and fewer, the quality of history is worse and fewer. So he's saying what happened? You had this great glorious age of production of great literature, really accurate, detailed histories, a lot of sophisticated stuff, and then you have all this kind of sort of poor copies of it, right? For hundreds of years until his own day, then stuff starts picking up again. It's what happened in that period. So him is that's the Dark Ages. He did not mean anything more than that. Now later people picked up the phrase and sort of piling on, noticing more things fit this model. So during the same period, we're talking roughly 500 to 1000 AD, right? So there's different datings, 400, 900, 500 1000, whatever, but it's in there. Also, we're talking about the West. We're talking about Europe. We're not talking about Byzantium, which is the Eastern Roman Empire. Different story, what happened there. But in the Western half, in the European half, the scholars who use the phrase Dark Ages talk about the fact that we have less access to what was going on there. The documentation is more fabulous, less accurate, less quantified. We start to get good quantification and good literature after 1000, right? So the Dark Ages does not mean the whole Middle Ages, right? It's just this one phase after the total collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, and what you would call what's called the High Middle Ages. And the High Middle Ages start roughly around 1000 AD, give or take. After that, things start to get better. But you can look at so many metrics, not just literature, science, technology, industry, economy, urbanization, population size. You can just go over and over, productivity, everything. The Dark Ages were a tremendous dip, a catastrophic drop in all of these metrics, all at the same time, which can't be a coincidence, right? So something happened, it was pretty dark. And so what will happen is, so we know it happened. There's no doubt that this happened. The evidence, archaeology, the literature, it's 100% solid. There's no way to doubt this. So the argument gets over semantics. It's well, what should we call it, right? And Dark Ages seems completely suitable to me, in the sense, we lost a bunch of stuff. There's a huge decline, and that includes informational decline. So our informational access is gone. A good example is the number of inscriptions. So the amount of inscriptions that we have to reconstruct Roman history is massive. It's hard to even explain how massive the epigraphic trend was in the Roman Empire. Tons and tons of epigraphy that we can work from. In the Dark Ages, we have we're talking drops to maybe 100th as much, right? It's a huge drop in our access to information.
That alone should raise eyebrows.
Yeah. Oh, wait for it. It gets worse when you start looking at population. So as one historian, and I cite several historians who agree with me on this, I'm not alone, about that we really should not be downplaying this. And so the movement to get the semantics to use softer language or whatever is actually not only disingenuous, but it's insulting to the horrors that happened as a result of this. It's like we owe it to the people, the millions and millions and millions of people who died because of this. And so you can see this in the archaeology, the scholars will point out, is that you see urbanization, like the population sizes of these cities. And we can do this through, hydrological research. We can see how much water these cities were consuming. We can see like habitation, like how many buildings were habited and things like this. Lots of different ways we can triangulate how many cities there were and how populated they were. And when you get into the Dark Ages, there's a massive drop, like I can't remember the amount, but it's a huge drop. And this one scholar points out that means that we had a society that was sustaining about 100 million people, and we went within like 100 years to a society that could sustain 50 million people. That means millions and millions of people starved to death because they couldn't, like, there's just no food for them. There's no water supply for them. Or maybe they died in other ways, but the thing is like this is a mass death era because the civilization that was supplying people with food and water and all the things to keep them going collapsed, right? And so there's mass death, right? We know this is a fact. And then you can look at like science, like all the science that the Romans and Greeks and Romans achieved, almost all of that was forgotten. It had to be reinvented after the Dark Ages or rediscovered because some of this stuff survived in the Eastern Roman Empire.
And some of it, the Arabic Muslims capitalized in their golden age.
Yes, they survived stuff as well. They had a renaissance that got quashed.
Yeah, due to fundamentalism.
The Renaissance in Europe, the Catholic Church also tried to quash that, but the Catholic Church lost its grip on power because of the Reformation. So the Catholic Church basically declined in its ability to suppress this stuff, whereas there was more ability to suppress it in the Islamic world. They didn't have the kind of like the fracture of sects that would back science against the other sect. Like we didn't have that. So it succeeded in killing it there. But even the Renaissance there was just like the beginning of a recovery of lost knowledge. There's not a lot of new stuff in the Islamic thing. And this is the thing that I think a lot of the historians do. The Islamic scholars get this wrong. Medieval scholars get this wrong because they don't look at the evidence for the ancient world. And so they look at all these like kind of brilliant, clever things coming up in the Renaissance and in both Renaissances, right? And they think, wow, there's new stuff, there's new genius and new things being discovered. And it's like, actually, no, all that stuff was already known, and they're really just using lost manuscripts to recover lost knowledge. They're not doing a lot that's new. And in fact, you don't even get to any level, like if you talk about the scientific knowledge that we had in the Roman Empire, we don't get back to that, like equal to that, until about the 15th century. And so you're talking like you've got the Dark Ages, and then think where it was a massive decline, and then in the year 1000 we start digging our way out of the hole, but it still took 500 years to get back to where we started, right? So the Dark Ages is kind of like the hole that we fell into, and then the High Middle Ages was crawling out of that hole, and then the High Renaissance and early modern era is, we say the High Renaissance is when we finally like get back, and then the modern era that's finally we're getting ahead. We're building.
What were major causes based on your research?
Yeah, I'll get into that. Let me hit a few other data points. Okay. So I talked about cities. Another one is the two things. So shipwrecks. Okay, so the counting shipwrecks, that tells you how much trade there was. So this corroborates this story I'm telling, right? So if you look at shipwrecks from the Roman Empire versus the Dark Ages, massive decline, which means the amount of trade was massive decline. So you have massively fewer ships sailing with products.
Economic decline.
Yeah. So like, so that's another example. You could look at other things. You compare, for instance, the encyclopedists like Celsus from the 1st century, Pliny, and then you look at like Isidore and these Dark Ages encyclopedists, and they look like morons by comparison. Like they're full of like fanciful, ridiculous things. They barely understand the stuff that they're repeating. So like the decline and even the understanding of the transmitted knowledge is profound. Like it's really just a collapse, intellectual collapse, and collapse of the education system, collapse of the civilization, collapse of the trade system, like everything, right? And another point of this is my favorite one, is ice cores. So you can show, they could dig these ice cores because like in the Antarctic and Arctic, these cores, the snow builds over thousands of years. And so and it traps the atmosphere. So you can get a glimpse of what the atmosphere was like every year for thousands of years. That's right. And one of the big ones is lead, right? So lead is a big, because lead gets everywhere, and it is a byproduct of a lot of other industrial activities. So mainly silver mining, but also as all kinds of mining and production and manufacturing. Lead was one of the main products, and it gets everywhere, so it's easy to see. So if you look at like lead levels, right, in the ice cores, and you see like it peaks like tremendously under the Roman Empire, which shows a massive level of industrial production. And then you have this massive decline to almost nothing, right? The Dark Ages, very little is going on. And then you don't get that peak to the same level of production again until, again, the 15th century, right? So it's the same story, right? You can see this. So the data is beyond dispute. There's no way to argue this. But it's often skewed by this refusal to realize how advanced things were in the Roman Empire, right? So usually there's an attempt to sort of downplay that, like, oh, they weren't really as advanced. Oh, their industry wasn't really that great. Oh, they didn't really have that many scientific inventions, which is all false because that's easily refuted. And that's in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. I give all the data and scholarship you need to show that that's just not the case.
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
So much talked about it.
Yeah, and that's a culmination of a movement in my field of ancient science that was happening while I was in grad school, because at the start of like 2000, the view was this minimalist view, but by the time I graduated, like the whole scientific field, ancient science field, had moved to my position, and with tons of publications. So there was a lot of scholarship to cite. It was great because they're all saying like, no, that was wrong. Like we had way more advances, a lot more was going on in the Roman Empire, and so that shows that how deep and bad the Dark Ages was, because you have to compare it. You can't compare it to what came after. You have to compare it to what came before, because you're talking about the dip, right? You got to have the dip. And it really did pause us for about 1,000 years, if you think of it, like at least 500. But if you think the time it took to dig out, you add that's 1,000 years. So you say let's say 235 AD to let's say 1535 AD, like in that period, we're kind of not really making any progress, where we had a massive loss and then a recovery, but it took that 1,000 years, a little more than 1,000 years, to get back to what we had lost, right? So that was a huge pause button. Can you imagine, like, had that not happened, we'd be right now, you and I would be 1,000 years more advanced scientifically, technologically, economically, and so on. So can you imagine what that would be like? So we lost that because of this. So it was really apocalyptic in that sense. Even if it like took 100 years for the whole collapse to occur, so that people aren't directly seeing how it's not like a nuclear war or a virus or something that, like all the post-apocalyptic movies that we have. The decline took about 100 years. It wasn't like one generation, right? But it's still, the decline happened. It was massive. In the East, the decline also happened. It just it wasn't as catastrophic. So it wasn't a cliff. And so in the East, it just, it survived the collapse of Western civilization, but then slowly declined until it finally collapsed, the Byzantine Empire in the 15th century. And then when that happened, all of this literature that was sitting in their libraries eventually got west. And this supercharged the high Renaissance in the West, because now they're getting back all these documents they lost, which is another thing about the Dark Ages. So much was lost. And we know this because it was still sitting in libraries in the East, but it was completely unknown in the West for 1,000 years, right? And so this stuff finally filters back, and people are looking at it. They're reading like Lucretius and lost works of Galen and Ptolemy and stuff like, this is amazing stuff. How did we not know about this? And so you can see how the reaction is like, shit, that really was a dark age. Like we really lost all of this stuff. And we lost more because the East also was in steady decline and was increasing disinterest in science too. So it's important to note that the catastrophic economic collapse that resulted in what we call the Dark Ages, even though that didn't happen in the East, the same result is that there was no scientific progress in the East at all. So basically science stopped at about 300 AD, maybe 250 AD. Nothing new happened at all, like nothing significant, right? So, and that reflects not economic loss, because they had money, they had resources, they had libraries, etc. They were tasking monks with preserving things, but they weren't using it. They weren't building on it. They lost interest in science. And why that is a whole other story that I do tell in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire.
So, I'm thinking of Julian the Apostate in the early 4th century, roughly, early to mid 4th century. And his cries from these ancient texts that are like just begging, like, look at what's going on. These Christians are coming in, and they're really ruining our culture and how much we were up here, and now we're
Right, yeah.
he's like
He's seeing it all happen already, yeah.
yeah.
It's, and yeah, and of course you start to see that with the more, like, violent hostility too, like, Hypatia gets literally mass murdered, murdered by a mass of Christians over this. Like, how dare a woman teach philosophy? What do we need philosophy for? It's like the Bible's the only thing that matters, that kind of attitude. So you see this stuff happening, this sort of rage and hostility against the old world and science and things like that. But it's not just like those were the extremists, right?
Yeah.
There were exceptions. There were intellectuals who at least respected knowledge and the old knowledge and stuff, but they lost the values that are necessary for moving the ball down the field. So, and I talk about this, I give examples and cite scholarship on this in my book on the scientist in the early Roman Empire, which is that they lost empiricism. So empiricism is the view that evidence trumps authority. So the Christian culture flipped that. It's the Bible and religious authorities trump evidence. So the idea that evidence could refute the Pope, like that was not a popular thing anymore. So this interest in empiricism declined. And so you can see the actual like dumb things that show up in Isidore and these other like medieval scholars, like they're just gullibly believing lore and legends and stuff, and they're not really doing experiments, they're not fact checking, like the interest in empiricism has declined. Curiosity is also being attacked. And so this is what there have been a lot of studies of the value of curiosity over time that show that curiosity was a denigrated value. It was dangerous to be curious during the Christian era. So like curiosity, and so like start asking questions about like, well, what if we cut into the human body to see how it works? We already see Tertullian saying that's against the will of God. If God wanted you to know it, he wouldn't have hidden it inside, right? So it's the kind of thing like your devilish curiosity to know things is really you're turning your mind away from God, and so it's bad, right? So curiosity is bad, right? So but you need curiosity for science, right? And then a belief in progress. So the ancient Romans believed that you could make incremental progress in science and other fields. The Christians didn't believe that. They believed that no, if it's this progress for them was greater faith in God, right? Like there was the idea that you could through your own decisions make society better, that you could increase decrease income disparity through economic mechanisms, through technology, things like that. They didn't believe in that. They didn't think that it was possible for fallible humans. If the world could be better, God would make it better. Like it's this idea that humans can't do anything.
It's like a form of fatalism in a way.
Yeah, it's this idea that there is no progress. Why work for it? And in fact, it's vain. It's
all
vain.
gonna go away one day anyway.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. That also is the thing. The idea that apocalypticism was very anti-progress too. Is like, why bother trying to make progress? It's all going to be gone in a moment, right? So, and also it's like the emphasis on godly things. So this is where the hero was the guy who went all cynic and like abandoned all technologies and all things and went and lived on a pillar, right? Like this is the guy who ate bread the rest of his life and just prayed to God. Like that's the ideal, not the intellectual who is like solving a hydrological problem, right? Like that wasn't your hero at the time. So yeah, you have this decline in values. And when you look at the Renaissance, what distinguishes it is the recovery of those values. So you have these Christians are kind of getting pissed off at the previous Christian era, denigrating them. And so they're now arguing with their fellow Christians now that they're being exposed to these values through the recovery of pagan texts, right? So they're reading this pagan stuff and like, this is really great stuff. Like, why did we get rid of this? And so you had this argument like saying like, we should get back to doing these things. Empiricism makes a lot of sense. Curiosity sounds like it should be virtuous.
In the art.
Right, yeah. So all of that, it all reflects, it all ties in. And so that's what the Dark Ages was and why it matters. Christian values did keep us in the hole longer, and that's the key thing. I do not, however, ascribe to the view that Christians caused this. And this is you had asked this earlier, is like did this, and this is different. Like this is another example of the decoupling problem. People have a hard time decoupling two different concepts that they've emotionally entangled. And so the idea that the Dark Ages existed gets entangled with the idea that Christianity is responsible for it. And because that offends Christians or people who are, or have, a love-hate relationship with Christianity or whatever, it offends them. So because the cause can't be true, therefore the effect can't be true. It's just like climate change, where no one wants to do anything about it because it would be expensive and inconvenient to take steps to care about climate change. So therefore, there must not be climate change. But you notice there's two different propositions, like whether it is and whether you should do something about it are separate, but people get so emotionally entangled between the two that they don't want it to be the case that they have to do something about it. So what is that thing to do? Deny that it exists all. And so the denial of the Dark Ages is the same thing, because of this emotional entanglement with the idea that Christians caused it. And it isn't true that the Christians caused it. It is true that the Christians made it worse, and they made it last longer than it should have. Christianity was not the solution, right? You had to go back to pagan values. That's what happened in the Renaissance, was the rebirth of pagan values, and they started to take back over. And it was so this rejection of pagan values is what really fucked us over in the Dark Ages. It's also what led to the inevitable decline and destruction of the Byzantine Empire too. So they didn't have this catastrophic collapse; they have this slow collapse. But it was caused by the same abandonment of pagan values that were good for, the curiosity, empiricism, progress. They abandoned those things. The Renaissance got it back, and that only happened successfully in Europe, which is why it didn't happen in the Middle East, because it got successfully suppressed there. So that's why Europe had the leg up and got to conquer the world, because they got to build on top of the achievements of the Romans and create, the British Empire, et cetera, that, leads to the rest of colonial history and everything that we talk about in terms of modernity, the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution. All of that is because of that, and it happened there for that reason. So that's the story of it. But what caused it? Now, this is the thing that I talk about this in the last chapter of Not the Impossible Faith. I think I do talk about it a little bit in Scientist and the Early Roman Empire. But especially there, because I talk about, there's arguments about the role of steam power and stuff like that. And I talk about that in the book too. But no, here's what happened. There were two things that did this. One was the Roman Empire never developed a constitutional government that had peaceful succession of power. And because that's really the main thing. And so what happened was they were stuck on an endless cycle of civil wars. So you would have a dynasty and it would hold with an iron fist, but then the dynasty dies out either because as the inevitable decline of any dynasty, like the third son is going to be some asshat that can't do anything well, right? So that's why you start with the brilliant Augustus and end with the idiot Nero, right? Like there's that kind of path. And so the question becomes, then what that happens, there's no rules or system set up for a peaceful succession of power. And so what happens, everybody rises up, you got a civil war.
You're the four emperors.
Exactly. And so you have this civil war, and then this keeps happening. You've got these dynasties, and like the year of the age of 5 great emperors that they talk about, the 5 good emperors, was caused by using adoption to get around this. Instead of giving your biological son the inheritance, you pick the best guy, adopt him, and give him it. And that worked fine until Marcus Aurelius had a living son, and he abandoned this because he didn't realize that this was a good model, and he gave it to his idiot son who fucked everything up. And then you got a civil war, right? And then you had the Severans, and then at the end of the Severans, you got another civil war. So if you have no constitutional government that allows for a peaceful succession of power, then you can't sustain an empire, because you're stuck in this constant loop of civil wars. Eventually, just by rolling dice, eventually one of those civil wars is going to be way bad. It's just like, that civil war wasn't so bad. It's like, yeah, but if you keep having them, like you're just rolling dice, eventually Snake Eyes is coming, right? And so this is the thing, when you get at 235, that civil war lasted 50 years. And it was just constant civil war, emperors, dynasties being wiped out within a matter of years after years after years. This 50 years long civil war. It ends with Diocletian, and he's the last, and he solves it with absolute iron fist fascism, right? Complete with draconian price controls, and like people are getting their head chopped off for selling peas at a higher price. Like, it's the most extreme fascistic system you can think of. That's Diocletian, and he solves it. And then, of course, there's still another civil war, that gets us Constantine, and then, of course, that gets us a Christian empire. And then that kept everything worse, because Christians couldn't solve these problems because they had the wrong values to solve these problems. But there's a double problem here, is that there was a 50-year civil war, but at the end of it, there was a collapse of the fiduciary economy, which means that there was the equivalent of the Great Depression, where the value of their money collapsed suddenly. So imagine if the United States, our 5-year civil war, imagine it lasted 50 years. So it lasted all the way to the 1929 collapse. So we have a civil war, and then the Great Depression. Like, for 50 years civil war, and then the Great Depression. We would be done. Yeah. Our country would be cooked. It would be Road Warrior, right? Like, it would be nothing. So that's what happened to Rome, right? And it's the Christians weren't responsible for this. Like they weren't responsible for the Roman constitution's failure to do anything about this. They weren't responsible for the collapse of the fiduciary economy. So and that's another thing, like monetary policy. One can get into like how the Romans botched that, but it was largely because of the Civil War. They lost control of their monetary policy. So, and the Civil War created what you would call lack of confidence, because if you get to a point, like if you last 50 years of Civil War, people start to lose confidence in the government, because like you might not even exist tomorrow, like because the last one disappeared a year ago. Like I can't trust your currency because you're not going to be here then, right? So that's what resulted in a loss of faith in the currency and resulted in the collapse. So it was really the Civil War, it was really the constitutional government thing. For those who are interested in current events, how this might reflect might make a good parallel here. It really matters that we have a peaceful succession of power system. It's the only thing that keeps your civilization going. So you can like compare it to current events, right? In terms of how important it is to have a peaceful succession of power, which it has to be a constitutional government that people back and stand by and don't break or corrupt, right? And you have to have that. Otherwise, you're going to collapse. It's just a matter of time, right? You can't sustain an empire without this. Anyway, so that happened, and so you had, this is now 285, we've got this massive collapse, we've got this fascist return to try and do things, and even it didn't fix anything, because you had an immediate civil war that resulted in Constantine coming in. And so you had all of that. This also started the beginning of the splitting of the empire, so it was starting to split and reunite over the Civil War period, and then through Diocletian and beyond. And so you see that there were attempts to keep the empire together, but it just kept falling into two halves, the European half and the Eastern half. And so you had the Byzantine Empire versus the European half. And so that's why the Dark Ages collapsed the Western Empire, but the Byzantine was independent enough to kind of resist those effects and like stand on its own, because it had a lot of money, had a lot of resources. The overall picture, though, is that 4th century was a really important, crucial century. That was the century where you could have led a recovery. If you think like the Great Depression, or even the Civil War, like our Reconstruction, right? You have the Civil War, and we led a really deliberate Reconstruction effort. If you look at the collapse in 1929, we had the New Deal. We had a really deliberate effort to fix everything. And this comes from empiricism, a curiosity, a belief in progress. Like those values drove those movements to fix things. The Christians fixed nothing. They had no values that would drive them to fix any of the fundamental institutional things that needed to be fixed to prevent this inevitable decline. And what happened in the 4th century is just going down, 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 down. In the 4th century, you have tons and tons of money being sucked up to the elite. The rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and consequently you're getting more riots, you're getting more loss of control. It's dissolving because of this massive income disparity, and that eventually results in the collapse of civilization due to the greed of the people at the top. And the Christian church was completely complicit in this. It did nothing at all to stop this from happening. It just basically sat by and watched the decline of civilization, its utter collapse.
Is it also true that there was lots of invasions from outside of Rome?
Well, this is a consequence, right? So like imagine the US model, like let's say the US Civil War lasted 50 years and we had the Great Depression. Who would invade us, right? Like we'd get invaded everywhere, right? Like because we would be completely collapsed. It would be land for the taking. And so that's kind of what happened is that we always had barbarians on our borders, and the Roman Empire always had means of managing them. And there were always like incursions, we fight them back and so on. Sometimes we'd make deals and make alliances, create a border buffer and so on. The Romans had a really decent model for this. But once your fiduciary economy has collapsed, once you've killed off like half your military forces through a 50-year civil war, once you've got this massive hoarding of wealth and then creating massive income disparity, and no one has any faith in the government anymore, and it's like your ability to fight these barbarian incursions declines. So the walls basically just crumble, and then now you've got this double problem where your massive mishandling of civilization results in these invasions, and now you have to burn even more resources fighting those, and so you're getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and just cities are collapsing. Yeah, it's a deadly cycle you can't get out of.
That happened with Byzantium and Sasanian empires with Islam.
It took a lot longer, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, by the time they had civil war, or war after war, not even civil war, war after war after war, the Sasanian Persians and the Byzantine Christians, and they were weakened after 50 to 100 years And then at that point, Muhammad shows up on the scene. The tribes of Arabia literally are able to go up and take, hey, everybody else is weak, poor. They have they're just broken, and they're able to easily conquer and use their income.
Yeah.
So they're now giving money to have them
Yeah.
join their tribes
which in turn makes everybody poorer and makes it easier to conquer them and makes everybody poorer. And
Right.
makes it, it's this deadly cycle.
That's why
of
they
just-
could conquer so much
Yes,
so
right.
fast, is that
Yeah.
everybody was weak and poor.
Yeah, yeah, and it's the cycle of the poverty causes the invasions, and the invasions worsen the poverty, and it's one of those vicious cycles, but to get out of that, you can't just pray to God, right? Like you need a deliberative, like evidence-based policy to try and get yourself out of it, and that's what we had with Reconstruction and the New Deal. We had like logical, sensible, evidence-based models for how to fix things so that we don't fall into those pits. Christianity had no tools for doing this, like no concepts, no values that were capable of stopping this, and so that's how it happened, and then why we got stuck there for so long is this. Took them forever to figure out how to get out of that.
Wow, there's so much here. War.
Yeah.
War was a hell of a thing, right?
Yeah.
And also,
Well, yeah, and also it's not just blame war, right? War is kind of like a byproduct of the things that matter most, which is attention to economics, right?
right.
Economics is probably the most important thing here, really, because if you have a populace that's not impoverished, then they care more about sustaining the system that they're in.
Right.
And so it's much harder. Like invaders don't have allies across the borders because they don't want the barbarian system because they like the system they're in.
Yeah.
So economics matters in terms of maintaining even like a peaceful succession of power, because if you have a good economic system, even the elite don't want these constant civil wars because it fucks up business, man. Right? So a good, sensible economic ideology is one of the things that can keep you going to the things that you need to do. You've got to make sure we need this reliable constitutional succession of power, like that. There's an economic basis for not only getting there, like driving you to create this, but also for driving you to maintain it, and then also making able to maintain it, because a good economic engine allows you the resources to maintain that kind of system.
Again, I'd like to sum up. I'll just sum up and say this. There's a lot that can be learned from this to keep us, it's kind of scary, even for our modern context where a lot of this is outside of our power. And the more we educate ourselves and like see what is going on and consider what Dr. Carrier is saying here and evaluate the past, seeing what's not worked and what does work, we should try to aspire to take in more education, learn better. The more we can learn and figure out better ways to implement these kind of things, rather than faith, rather than, dogmas, I think we'll be on a safe space. So get his books, literally books, plural, on Amazon. Link will be in the description. He's got the latest, greatest book on the obsolete paradigm of the historical Jesus, but also the ancient science, if you will, in the Roman Empire. And there's so much there you really need to check out. I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thanks.